What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Moments with the Marcelins. My name is June.
And my name is Stephanie. Welcome to season 2.
Yes, we made it to another season. I'm very excited for today's episode because this is our first interview. Can you let them know a little bit about who we spoke to and what did we speak about?
Yes, absolutely. So we had the opportunity to interview Dr. Antonio Cediel. He is an amazing individual, and he actually works with an organization called Live Free. And so this organization actually is faith-based, and what they do is really unleash congregations to set people free. What happens is they partner with churches to empower the church to really be a voice to those that are marginalized in our community. And so they really advocate for gun violence reductions and also the mass incarceration issues in our country as well. And so Dr. Cediel, he has actually, before even working with Live Free, he was actually in education for many, many years. He taught from middle school all the way to Harvard, graduates and students as well. He has written many pieces on gun violence and racial justice and other topics for the New York Times, USA Today, and The Root. And he also has a bachelor's in religious studies from Brown University, a master's in art in Latin American history from the California State University, and also a master's and doctorate degree from Harvard Graduate School of Education. But over that, he is a man of God. He is married to Stephanie, and she's an amazing woman and also have 2 daughters as well.
Well, go ahead and take your notes out, and we hope that you enjoy this conversation. If you can tell us just a little bit about yourself and what is it that you do?
Sure. Well, good to be with you guys today. Where do I start? My background really is as an educator. And so I was a teacher, and I was a high school principal, and I was a deputy superintendent of schools, part of that time in California, part of that time in Boston, Massachusetts. 3 years ago or so, moved the family out here to Orlando, Florida. And for the last 10 years, I've been working on a national faith-based campaign around reducing gun violence and mass incarceration in our country.
That's incredible. When did you know? Was there a moment in your life where you knew that this was the type of work that you wanted to get into? You said that you were, previously in education. So how did that transition happen? And was there a moment where you realized, like, this is what I want to do next?
Yeah, I don't think there was any one specific moment, but there were definitely things about my work as an educator which led me to this moment. So when I was a teacher in Oakland, California, it was definitely a neighborhood, an area where there was a lot of gun violence, a lot of folks who were impacted by the criminal legal system. And so, for example, I had kids who, I would drive home from school back to home every day just so they wouldn't get jumped or wouldn't be in danger, crossing different neighborhoods and stuff. And so that was always something that was, kind of top of mind. And when I was a principal, I had a young man who was shot right in front of the school. And I was one of the first people to get to him. It was ironically, we had parents there at the school one evening, and I was giving a tour to prospective parents and trying to explain to them that the school wasn't as dangerous as they'd heard, and that, we were making changes and doing all this stuff. Yeah. And at about 8 p.m., right as folks are filing out of the meeting, shots ring out, and a young man was shot right, within feet of the front door of the school. And so, that sense of the fragility of life, really. And I also say I grew up partly in Colombia as a kid, and during some of the most violent years in Colombia as well. So I think always just having a sense that life is fragile, and there's a lot of violence that's impacting folks from all walks of life. So
absolutely. And like you told us, you work for this organization called Live Free Campaign. I want to read an excerpt from the website, and then I want to follow up with a question. It says, "As a people of faith, we know that our country's legacy of racism, violence, and economic exploitation runs counter to what is prescribed in our most sacred texts. Sadly, the wealthiest and the most powerful nation in the world is also one of the most violent and most punitive. With almost 12,000 gun murders a year, more than the annual death toll of U.S. soldiers during the Vietnam War, and the highest incarceration rate in the world, we find ourselves in a moral crisis, a crisis which disproportionately impacts the poor and communities of color. With over 118 million people attending weekly services and over 350,000 100,000 congregations across the U.S., we believe that a social justice revival within our faith institutions transform our nation's heart and minds, and ultimately the policies and practices that perpetuate these evils. With hundreds of congregations as well as countless leaders and movement partners through the country, the Live Free campaign is working to end the scourges of gun violence, mass incarceration, and the criminalization of Black and brown bodies that tears the soul of society. Such a powerful statement. And I guess the follow-up question that I would have for that is, can you inform us, what is Live Free campaign currently doing, and what has the organization been doing to reduce gun violence and mass incarceration?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the Live Free campaign is part of the Faith in Action Network, which is the largest network of faith-based community organizers in the country. And so the Live Free campaign is a specific campaign that focuses on gun violence, mass incarceration, the criminalization of Black and brown people in this country. The things that we focus on, so in terms of the gun violence piece, which I was talking about before, after those incidents I described, in Oakland, we started organizing to try and get proven practices, proven programs up and running in order to reduce gun violence in the city of Oakland. And what people often don't realize is that there are proven evidence-based strategies out there for dramatically reducing urban gun violence. So whenever there's a mass shooting, for example, people start arguing about gun control and gun rights. But those mass shootings are only about 2% of homicides, of gun homicides in this country. Most of the homicides are really happening in the cities on an ongoing basis. And so given the fact that there are proven strategies, we should be implementing. And so the program that we got up and running in Oakland has reduced shootings and homicides by 50%. In other cities, it's gotten similar results. So after Oakland, organizers that were connected with Live Free helped push programs in Stockton, California, and Sacramento, California, which have also gotten 50% reductions in a short amount of time. And similar strategies have been used in all different parts of the country. And so to me, it's kind of like we have penicillin for an illness, but no one is distributing the penicillin. And so the organizing is critical because it requires putting pressure on mayors and city councils and others to just fund the programs that we know work in order to save lives. So that's a lot of what we do around the country in terms of the gun violence work, which we're trying to scale up to more cities. On the decarceration side, as you mentioned earlier, the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world, in the history of the world, actually. Yes. So, we think about totalitarian regimes like, China or, places like that. They don't lock up nearly as many people as the United States does. And so we got to ask ourselves that why in the largest Christian country in the world do we lock up so many people? Is it that we're more evil than anyone else, or is there something wrong with our system? And our contention is that we have some systems in place that disproportionately lock up people and essentially criminalize the country.
That's crazy. When I was looking at your website, it talked about the body, the ballot, the buck framework that you guys really try to implement and also bring education to congregations. Can you kind of explain what the system is in regards to what the body, the ballot, the buck framework that you guys use?
Sure. Yep. So the body represents kind of the organizing, the mobilization of people. People think of it in terms of the protest, but it's just more generally in terms of mobilizing people to use their collective power, right? So as an example of the gun violence, mobilizing people who've been directly impacted by violence, mobilizing faith leaders and congregations, people who care deeply about the issue to exert their influence to get local government to do the right thing and to save lives. So that's the body. The ballot, of course, is voting. Because civic engagement is critically important in terms of getting the types of policies and practices in place that can save lives as well. And the buck, it has to do with the economic resources that are required to really develop our communities and to keep folks healthy. When we're talking to mayors and city councils and other folks, a lot of the conversation is about how are they using their budget. There's been a lot of conversation in the last 6 months or so about police funding. And one of the things that folks, it's important for folks to understand is in a lot of cities, law enforcement takes up, 30, 40, 50, 60% of a city's budget. And so the question is, how do you keep everyone safe? If you're just keeping certain neighborhoods safe, but the ones where people are getting shot, you're not implementing anything, then that is not a real equitable way of going about things. So as peacemakers, we consider ourselves peacemakers, and that's what God has called us to be. Yeah. Part of making sure that there is peace in the streets is how we make our investments. And so that's part of our platform.
Awesome. Would you mind sharing some victories that the Live Free campaign has seen as far as ban the box, mass incarceration, the school to prison pipeline, police accountability, and urban gun violence?
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the things that we push for include bail reform, for example. So in this country, there's over 500,000 people who are sitting in jail right now who have not been convicted of anything. They're in jail because they're too poor to pay bail or bond, right? And for some folks, it's $500, but they don't have $500, and someone in their family doesn't have $500. So you can sit in jail for weeks, months, or more, just waiting for a trial. And so if you are someone who are sitting in jail, you're going to quickly lose your job, right? Because, a couple of days without going to your job, you lose your job. Now you can't pay your rent, so you might get evicted. If you have kids, you might lose custody of your children, right? So all these things can happen because of the inability to pay a $500 or $1,000 bail, right? And so there needs to be some serious bail reform in order for it to be not just poor people who are being locked up, but it has more to do with actual public safety. So we've had some successes around some of that. In Indianapolis, it's one of the cities that we've been organizing a lot in. They've been getting some good reductions in terms of incarceration. Since we're here in Florida, I'll talk about Amendment 4 here in Florida, which passed a couple of years ago. The history of Florida in terms of criminalizing people and in terms of voting rights is an important story because and this is not just Florida, but Florida's been one of the most egregious cases. After the Civil War, when Black folks were freed from slavery, one of the ways that the country kept control of them, that government agencies and other folks, is by convicting them of crime, often for very petty things like loitering or things like that, right? Once you've convicted someone of a crime, the Constitution says that basically you can keep them in some form of slavery, the 13th Amendment. And so some of the rights that they lose, including the right of freedom, even when they get out, they lose the right to vote. And this is a critical political piece because after slavery ended, all of a sudden, particularly in the South, folks started electing a lot of Black people. We had a number of Black congressmen and a senator and folks, but then when people realized, oh, this is going to shift the balance of power, they started using the criminalization in order to keep the Black population in check. And so to this day in Florida, we've had a situation in which if you are convicted of a felony, you lose the right to vote for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And in Florida, that's been about 1.5 million people. About 1/10 of the voting population, close to 25% of the Black voting population. So a couple of years ago in 2018, through the leadership of Desmond Meade, who was formerly incarcerated himself, formerly homeless, formerly addicted, through just a phenomenal story, and hopefully you get Desmond on here one of these days, spearheaded a movement that was a bipartisan movement. It relied heavily on people of faith, and it really focused on giving people second chances, right? The power of redemption, the power, right? All these things that as Christians we talk about. People were moved to actually change the Constitution in the state of Florida, which is what Amendment 4 did. It was a ballot measure in 2018 to automatically restore the rights of people once they've completed all terms of their sentence. And so that was the biggest expansion of the vote in the United States in about 50 years.
Yeah.
Right. So like, imagine like just the importance of that. Unfortunately, right now, and we'll probably talk more about voting, there's been a backlash against that and a number of attempts to still try to curtail people's ability to vote here in Florida.
Absolutely. And, it's awesome because, you and I we were a part of that. And so what was that feeling like for you kind of going backward when 2018 didn't occur, and Amendment 4 was passed? What was that feeling like for you?
When it passed?
When it passed.
Oh, I mean,
you knew there were going to be more hurdles.
Well, we figured there might be hurdles, but I mean, in the moment, it was just, complete happiness and joy and, having known Desmond for a number of years before then. So like, when I first met Desmond, there was no funding, no support, no infrastructure, no nothing. It was just Desmond Meade driving around the state, passing out stuff out the back of his car, talking to anybody who would listen. Right. And so, when you see it from that point to when it becomes a multi-million-dollar, ballot measure with, all kinds of celebrities and all kinds of people jumping in, it's just an amazing, transition. And Desmond was named one of Time's 100 most influential people, after that. Right. So I think it was, just joy and just this confirmation that if you are walking in God's will and you're willing to put in the work, that all kinds of doors can be open to you, even doors that are not expected to open. And so it was a wonderful confirmation of a lot of dreams and a lot of sweat and tears.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, being that, we both were kind of involved in that, what would you say to the Christian who says they're a little bit reluctant to get involved when it comes to biblical justice and things like that? Because, there's this belief with a lot of Christians where, it's the mindset of, well, just preach Jesus. And the question that I often have is, what Jesus are you talking about? The one in scripture or the one in your mind? And so there's a belief that justice is not biblical, and so what do you say to that, someone who might be hesitant or reluctant to get involved into biblical justice?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. There's a tendency in a lot of churches to focus on compassion ministries, which are important, right? When people are hungry, you need to feed them, right?
Yeah.
And at the same time, though, this component of a justice ministry to me is completely biblical. To me, justice is our alignment with God's will, having a godly order to things, right? And in order to get that, you actually need to change systems. You need to, create infrastructure, organization. You have to do a lot of things that get into policy and other realms. But I'm gonna be even more concrete about this. So when I think about and talk about justice with folks, I'll use my own daughters, right? So I have 2 little girls. If one of my daughters went to school and she was getting bullied and beat up and she comes home to me, what am I going to do about it? And so I ask other followers of Jesus just to think concretely, what would you do about it, right? When we talk about our own children, to me, that's the closest we get to the unconditional love that God offers us. That's why we talk about God as the Father, right? Because I think just conceptually, we have to think about father or mother or parenthood to understand the deep love that God has for us.
Yeah.
So imagine your own child, right, who's being abused, right? What will you do about it? Now, I've yet to find someone who says, all I'm going to do is pray for my child. So they, so yes, I'm going to tend to her wounds. I'm going to hug her. I'm going to comfort her. I probably will pray for her also, right? Of course, I'm going to do all those things, but that's not where it's going to end. Because what I want from my child is also justice. And justice in this context is for the abuse to stop. I don't just want to comfort her because this happened, but I don't want it to happen tomorrow or the next day or the next day. So I'll probably go to the school, talk to her teacher, talk to the principal, maybe talk to some other parent, find out what's going on and do everything in my power to stop it. Because I want justice for my child because of the depth of my love for her. Now we'll take it one step further. What if there are other children at the school who are being bullied and abused as well? Do I want justice for them too? Because now we're talking about social justice. Not just me and mine, but if I take Jesus' teaching seriously, I got to think about those other children, right? And my neighbors and their children, right, as my brothers and sisters. So now it looks a little different, because now I'm going to go to the school and maybe I'm going to start advocating to make sure that no children, no students are being beat up, harassed, bullied, whatever.
So good.
And that's social justice. And I believe that all Christians have a responsibility to be part of that.
That's good. Which leads me to my next question. When we talk about voting, there are quite a few people who feel like their voice doesn't make a count. It doesn't make a difference. They don't really want to endorse either candidate. And we're coming upon a big election. What would you say to the people who feel like their voice does not matter? And how should they approach the voting booth on November 3rd?
Great question. So number one, it can feel like it doesn't matter because you're just one in terms of millions of votes. But in a place like Florida and the number of other states, it comes down to just a small number of votes. Several, in the Bush-Gore election, it came down to a few hundred votes, right? So every vote does count. But I want folks to also think beyond the presidential election, right?
Talk about it.
Right, because if you look, so I've already got my ballot here in Florida and I've already filled it out, right? It's 4 pages. There's a whole bunch of people to vote for. So president is one, people think about, governor when the governor's up, or, Congress, whatever, and all those are important too. But there's a lot of local stuff, which people typically don't pay attention to, right? So how many people even know who their sheriff is? Who even knows who their state attorney is? Do you know, right? So, and then you got a whole list of judges on there. Does anybody know who the judges are, right? So when we talk about criminal justice, right? When we talk about decarceration, when we talk about trying to reform our system so that we do not lock up most people of any country in the world, that we actually provide some justice, those local positions actually are more influential than the ones at the top of the ticket, okay? So the sheriff is deciding how people are treated, right? So when you think about a George Floyd situation, for example, the sheriff is deciding who to hire, who to fire, how people are trained, deciding the standards of practice for the officers, deciding how they will interact with the community. All those things are decided there. The state attorney decides who is going to be charged with crimes, right? So will they ensure that there's justice for everyone, or do they have only certain segments of the population in mind? So, so we don't see a bunch of commercials necessarily, and you don't have zillions of dollars in those campaigns. But it is up to us, people who care about the peace in our neighborhoods, who care about public safety, who care about justice, to do the research. So I would say to folks, get your ballot early, right? And then spend a little bit of time doing some basic research about these candidates to find out who they are and what they believe in, what they stand for. To me, that's one of the best arguments for getting your ballot early, because if you just show up to the ballot box and see your ballot for the first time, there's no way you're going to know. Like, even I'm plugged into this stuff, but like, if I don't do my research beforehand about the ballot measures and about all these other candidates, I'm just going to be guessing when I get there. And that's not what we want.
Yeah. How can someone who's listening that's like, you know what, I want to be a part of this. I want to be a voice. I know that my vote is important. I, want to be a part of what Live Free is doing. How can someone take action?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's various ways to do it. So if, we have different federations in different parts of the country. If you're here in Florida, Faith in Florida is an organization that does Live Free work. They push the gun violence work and the decarceration work. They also work on immigration issues. And so that's an organization to link up with. Pastor Rhonda Thomas is the executive director, and she is a powerful woman of God trying to bring justice to the land. And I think, and even if you don't want to link in with a particular organization, I think you'll find in most cities and counties that there are already people working on some of these issues. So as you start to, dig into it, you'll find people who've been advocating for some of these things for a long time. I'm happy to talk to anybody who wants to figure out how to get plugged in. So, I'm a resource around that, but there's definitely lots of
That's
ways.
how I got connected, through you.
Yeah.
That's right. It's just sometimes it's as easy as one-to-one and just say, how do I get involved, and let's make it happen. And so, yeah, June, you were involved with the Amendment 4 campaign, and I think, plugged into a lot of good work. So, if you have the will, if you have the heart for it, I think it's very possible.
Absolutely. What would you say has been the most rewarding and the most challenging thing in this line of work for you?
Well, there are many challenges. I think at the end of the day, maybe one of the most frustrating things, and I guess I'll talk about the gun violence work, because as I said, we have proven evidence-based strategies that have been validated by research that have a track record. It drives me crazy how difficult it is to convince mayors and city councils and county commissioners to invest in these strategies. We've gone so far as to do studies to show on the economic side how much it costs every time someone is shot. I would think it'd be enough an argument just to make the moral argument we're trying to keep fewer people shot. But for those people who are thinking about dollars and cents, we've actually commissioned studies. So here in Orlando, for example, the cost of a single shooting is between $800,000 and $1.5 million.
Wow.
Regardless of whether they die or not, right? Because people are thinking always in terms of homicides, but you have to understand that for every gun homicides, there's about 5 or 6 more injury shootings.
Oh my goodness.
Okay? So my thing is that for the price of 1 or 2 shootings, we'll put together a program that will reduce many more. So if you're just, if you're coming from a fiscally conservative point of view, this should be a no-brainer in terms of that. So I think, when you ask about obstacles and that, I think the most frustrating thing is how difficult it is to convince people to invest. And that goes across party lines, Democrat, Republican, whatever. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that people don't always want to make the investments in some of the most directly impacted and most vulnerable communities that require it.
And what is the most rewarding thing for you has been?
Well, I think, obviously the Amendment 4 thing was a huge thing. I think every time we get a program up and running around gun violence, and then we actually see the reduction. So, I look at the reduction numbers each year and I feel like, man, I could sleep at night knowing, that some fewer people were shot, that fewer more people got to keep their lives, that you had a few more families who didn't lose a loved one, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's gratifying. But I think the other piece of it too is just interacting with, I love talking with other people of faith. So just last night I was on a call with like 40 pastors, and we were talking about immigration justice issues. Next week we're going to talk about criminal justice issues. And what I've seen is people who follow Jesus, right, their hearts can open very quickly to these issues if they just learn more about them. And because lots of us in our churches, because, the pastor doesn't talk about it, or there's not ministries connected to it, people just don't know, right? Yeah. They just don't know. So, when we've done conferences and stuff and like we did the Mission Talk conference and stuff like that, these folks come in and their hearts are open, but because they've never heard that we have the highest incarceration rate in the world. They don't know about necessarily all the gun violence unless they live in one of those neighborhoods. They don't know there's proven ways to stop it, right? So I think what's really gratifying, and this partly goes back to my background as an educator, is just the interactions with folks and having those moments where people say, oh, I didn't know that. That's something I'm more interested in. I'd love to get engaged.
It's good.
That's so powerful. Do you have any final thoughts or maybe even some advice to any listeners who maybe they're hearing this for the first time and they're like, I want to be more involved. I want to be more aware. I want to be more conscious. I'm a believer. How can I take this on and, and do something about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are many ways of getting involved. I think one of the key things is keeping your heart open and keeping a listening ear, because what you have to remember is whatever issue you decide to get involved in, there's people who've been doing this for decades, right? And they have a ton of knowledge and expertise about it. They might not always be a churchgoer, and you got to start to be okay with that, right? Because just because they didn't come at it the same way you did doesn't mean they don't have something to teach you, doesn't mean that they don't have some information that's important and some very good experience and wisdom about how to make a difference in that field, right? So like one of the things we talked about, we have another cohort of youth ministry leaders that we're working with. We're also doing a biblical justice cohort with them, and some of them are really focused on the issue of racial justice. And we were having a conversation last week, and one of them was talking about Black Lives Matter and saying that, you know, there's in the church, there's a lot of people who are uncomfortable with Black Lives Matter because, you know, some of them say they come from a Marxist background, or that, you know, they're not, you know, Christians or whatever it is. And it was a good discussion because what one of the young women was talking about was, and she came to this realization herself, is just because we don't agree with 100% of some of a particular platform doesn't mean that we get to say, forget about Black Lives Matter.
It's good.
Right? Yeah. So if you don't agree with one particular organization, like it's just one organization, it's just a few people, right? Because the Black Lives Matter movement is bigger than any particular organization.
Exactly.
It's masses of people who are basically just making the very, to me, non-controversial statement that Black Lives Matter. Yeah. I mean, how did we get to a point where saying Black Lives Matter is controversial? I mean, it's just
exactly
right.
It's been politicized. You're right.
So if you don't want to be a part of a particular organization, that's fine. Do it within your church. How can you, as a congregation, as a ministry, demonstrate that Black Lives Matter and take an anti-racist stance as part of your faith and part of your ministry, right? And so, you know, and again, if you're open to learning from people who've been doing this for a long time, take bits from different folks, but make it your own and make it relevant to your context.
That's good.
That's so good.
I love what you said when you said, even though you don't necessarily agree with everything, you know, I think it's about redeeming the phrase that Black Lives Matter. You know, you don't have to agree with the organization, with everything within the organization. But like you said, even within our differences, there's still much that can be learned. So final question. What can we learn more about, you know, Live Free, the Live Free campaign, like for anyone that is listening right now who kind of wants to just check out the organization and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, you can go to the website is livefreeusa.org, and you know there's some good you know, overview of the work we've done. So in this COVID time, one of our projects is we realized early on that a lot of vulnerable folks didn't have access to PPE, to masks and stuff like that, and so we raised over $1 million for masks for
that's great,
for folks who are incarcerated, for folks who are, you know, who are frontline workers, who homeless folks, other people who've been particularly vulnerable. And we know that Black and brown folks have been disproportionately affected by the virus. So that's one of the things. So there's a lot of different projects where we're going to, so you can check out the website, see some stuff that's going on. And if you're interested in learning more, then, you know, I'm definitely a resource.
How can someone get in contact with you if they have any questions or kind of want to follow up?
Yeah, well, you can email me. That's probably the easiest. So my email is Cediel, so ACEDIEL @faithinaction.org. And I'll be happy to follow up with anyone through that.
Thank you so much, Antonio. This has honestly been a pleasure.
Thank you, guys.
Man, that was such an amazing conversation. I learned so much. What about you?
Absolutely. Me too. I honestly feel challenged. I, you know, really believe that we have a part to play, you know what I mean, in this. And, you know, maybe you feel challenged as well. You know, if you have any questions on anything that was discussed today, feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy to answer or even connect you to any other organizations as well.
So thank you again for listening. Take care. God bless.
And much love.